The survivors, now fewer in number, trudge through a desolate landscape, their hope dwindling with each passing day. Milena leads what remains of the group, herself, the injured Marco, teenage Nicola, Maha, and the infant who represents a fragile glimmer of hope. Exhaustion, hunger, and paranoia plague them, turning every moment into a struggle. The outbreak is no longer confined to isolated areas, the entire quarantine zone teems with infected. The survivors encounter other groups, but the boundary between human and monster becomes increasingly unclear. The group stumbles upon a large refugee camp that initially seems like salvation. The camp is run by a self-proclaimed leader, Boris, who maintains order through fear. Boris controls the dwindling resources with an iron fist, using threats and executions to keep dissenters in line. Milena sees echoes of the rogue faction they previously fought, but the group is too desperate to leave immediately. Tensions rise as they witness Boris's brutal tactics, including throwing suspected infected into the wilderness to prevent contamination. Marco, though disgusted, sees the necessity in Boris's methods, sparking heated arguments with Milena. When a child in the camp shows symptoms of infection, Boris orders the execution of the entire family, including those who appear healthy. Milena protests, risking her life to shield them, but Marco holds her back, warning her of the consequences. This act solidifies the group's decision to escape the camp before they, too, are sacrificed. As the survivors secretly plan their escape, Boris's second-in-command, Irina, offers to help them. She reveals that she's grown tired of Boris's rule and hopes to overthrow him. However, Irina's motives are unclear, and Marco warns that trusting her is dangerous. During their escape attempt, Irina betrays them, alerting Boris in exchange for her own safety. A violent clash ensues, with the survivors fighting their way out of the camp amidst the chaos of an internal revolt. Nicola is injured, and the group loses Maha to the infected as they flee. Milena, devastated by Maja's loss, confronts Marco, accusing him of being too willing to abandon others for survival. Marco retorts that sentimentality will get them all killed, deepening the rift between them. The survivors seek refuge in an old train tunnel, but they are haunted by the growing signs of infection within their group. Nicola's injury festers, raising fears that he might turn. The tension becomes unbearable as Marco insists on preemptively killing Nicola to ensure the group's safety, while Milena refuses to give up on him. Their argument reaches a breaking point when Nicola, overhearing their debate, attempts to flee, fearing for his life. In the process, he draws a small group of infected to their hiding place. The survivors fend off the attackers, but Nicola is bitten, forcing Milena to make the heartbreaking decision to end his life herself. This act shatters Milena's spirit and brings her closer to Marco's hardened worldview, though it also deepens her resolve to find a solution to the outbreak. As their numbers dwindle, the survivors encounter more evidence of the infection's horrifying spread. A ghost town they pass through is filled with infected that seem to be mimicking their former lives. Shopkeepers standing behind counters, children playing in the streets, all of them grotesque shadows of humanity. Milena begins to question whether there's any point in continuing. Her once unshakable hope falters as the line between human and monster blurs. Meanwhile, Marco grows colder and more detached, seeing the infected not as people but as obstacles to be eliminated. The infected themselves seem to be evolving, with new mutations appearing. One encounter pits the survivors against a towering, heavily armored, brute, zombie, which they narrowly manage to kill by luring it into a collapsing building. Amid the chaos, Milena and Marco find themselves leaning on each other more than ever. Their bond deepens, but it is fraught with tension. Marco's cold pragmatism clashes with Milena's fading idealism, creating moments of both connection and conflict. In one vulnerable moment, Marco admits that he doesn't believe they'll survive but that he continues fighting for Milena and the baby. This admission humanizes him in Milena's eyes, but it also terrifies her, as it underscores the fragility of their situation. In a desperate bid for answers, the survivors track down a lead on the origins of the virus, an underground military laboratory rumored to have been the site of the initial outbreak. Upon reaching the facility, they find it overrun with infected and booby-trapped to prevent anyone from accessing the research. The group fights their way inside, where they discover fragments of data hinting at a potential cure. However, the files are incomplete, and the lead scientist, who has turned into a monstrous hybrid, attacks them. The battle is harrowing, with Marco ultimately sacrificing his safety to allow Milena and the baby to escape with the data. Marco is gravely injured in the fight, and Milena is left to care for him as they flee the facility. His condition worsens, and it becomes clear that he won't survive much longer. Despite this, Marco urges Milena to continue fighting, to protect the baby and ensure that the data reaches someone who can use it. In a final act of redemption, Marco stays behind to draw a horde of infected away from Milena, allowing her and the baby to escape. His sacrifice leaves Milena devastated but resolute. The chapter ends with Milena walking alone through the wasteland, the baby in her arms and the data clutched tightly to her chest. She is broken but determined, knowing that she is now the last hope for humanity. In the distance, the camera pans to a sprawling city overrun with infected, hinting that the true scale of the outbreak is far greater than anyone imagined. Milena steels herself for the battles to come, vowing to honor the sacrifices of those she has lost by continuing to fight for a future. The few remaining survivors, led by the resolute Milena and the gravely injured Marco, are at the brink of collapse. Their supplies are nearly gone, and the constant threat of the infected looms over them. Among the survivors are Milena, Marco, the infant, and two others, Irina, a former camp defector whose loyalties remain questionable, and Zoran, a resourceful but bitter ex-mechanic. After uncovering fragmented data about the virus's origins, the group learns of a heavily fortified military facility on the edge of the quarantine zone. The facility is rumored to house advanced weaponry and possibly a cure. Marco insists it's their only chance, but Milena worries it might be a trap or another dead end. The trek to the facility is fraught with danger. The group encounters a massive horde of zombies blocking their path through a canyon. Using makeshift explosives crafted by Zoran, they narrowly escape but lose Irina, who suspiciously lags behind during the attack. Marco suspects betrayal but chooses to keep moving. A new type of infected, fast, intelligent, and seemingly capable of communication, begins stalking the group. These hunters attack in packs, forcing the survivors into brutal close combat. Zoran is bitten during the fight but conceals his injury, knowing the group would not hesitate to eliminate him. The group finally reaches the facility, a massive, high-tech compound surrounded by layers of barbed wire, mines, and watchtowers. The military guards, still unaware of the full extent of the infection within the zone, refuse to let the survivors in. Marco devises a risky plan. Use Zoran's mechanical skills to bypass the outer security systems and sneak inside under the cover of darkness. Inside the facility, they discover horrifying truths. The military has been conducting experiments on infected civilians, attempting to create bioweapons. These experiments have produced terrifying hybrid zombies, which are being stored in cryogenic pods. The outbreak was not an accident but the result of a deliberate test gone wrong. The virus was designed as a weapon, but it mutated beyond control. Milena is horrified, while Marco grows colder, convinced the military is no better than the infected. As the group searches for supplies and information, Zoran's infection becomes evident. He begins to transform, endangering the group. Before they can act, Zoran succumbs to the virus and attacks. In the ensuing chaos, Marco is injured further, and the group loses critical supplies. The tension within the group reaches its peak when Irina reappears, revealing she has been working with the military all along. She was sent to lead survivors into the zone to gather data on how civilians react to the virus. Irina attempts to hand Milena and the baby over to the military, claiming it's for the greater good. Marco intervenes, killing Irina in a brutal fight, but the noise alerts nearby infected. The facility becomes a battlefield as a massive horde of infected, led by the intelligent hunters, breaches the perimeter. The survivors have no choice but to fight their way to the facility's core, where they hope to find an escape route or a cure. Marco, despite his injuries, fights with unmatched determination, holding off waves of infected to buy time for Milena and the baby. Milena discovers the lab where the cure was being developed. However, the data is incomplete, and the remaining sample is unusable. As the group reaches the facility's underground hangar, they discover a single helicopter fueled and ready to go. However, the horde is closing in. Marco realizes someone must stay behind to hold them off. In a heartfelt moment, Marco tells Milena to take the baby and leave. He gives her his dog tags as a reminder to finish the fight. Despite Milena's protests, Marco locks her in the helicopter and activates the launch sequence. Marco makes his final stand in the hangar, using explosives to destroy the facility and the advancing horde. His last words, spoken into the radio as Milena escapes, are, "Make this count." Milena, now alone with the baby, escapes the quarantine zone and lands in a desolate countryside. The sight of the devastated world beyond confirms her worst fears. The outbreak has spread beyond containment. Milena steels herself, clutching Marco's dog tags and the incomplete data on the virus. She knows the fight is far from over but vows to honor Marco's sacrifice by finding a way to end the plague. The chapter ends with a chilling scene. As the camera pans over the smoldering ruins of the facility, a mutated figure, larger and more menacing than any before, emerges from the wreckage. Its eyes glow with intelligence, hinting at a new evolution of the virus. Milena walks toward the horizon, the infant in her arms and the weight of humanity's survival on her shoulders.